This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's protagonist is none other than President Chester Arthur, with a script by the ever-factual Larry Holsworth. If Larry has provided his socials, they'll be linked next to my storytelling deep dive channel, Story Rant, my analog horror project, OEI, and more. With that said, let's jump into it. Chester Alan Arthur was the second American to ascend to the presidency as a result of the assassination of his predecessor. When he did so, few believed he was up to the task. He served the remaining 3.5 years of the term that James Garfield had been elected, and upon its completion, chose to retire rather than seek office on his own. Nonetheless, upon the completion of his term, he left office to considerable accolades. Mark Twain famously wrote of his presidency, "It would be hard indeed to better President Arthur's administration." Similar applause came from leading newspapers and political friends and foes alike. History, though, has not treated Arthur so kindly. In 2019, Time magazine released a list of the top 10 forgettable presidents, and Chester Arthur topped the list. One of the 5 men to occupy the White House without benefit of winning it through an election, he is generally regarded as an average president today. Not a failure, but far from a rousing success. And here's the thing, Arthur would likely have agreed with that assessment. Chester Arthur's parents met and married in Canada. His father, William Arthur, was born and educated in Ireland before he moved to Ontario, where he met and eventually married Malvina Stone. The couple moved to Vermont following their 1821 marriage, living in several different towns as William worked as a school teacher. By the mid-1820s, William had abandoned his teaching profession, his occasional study of the law, and his Presbyterian faith, becoming a Free Will Baptist and an ardent abolitionist. In 1828, William and his growing congregation and family had moved to Fairfield, Vermont. The following year, they welcomed their 5th child, whom they named Chester Alan Arthur. Eventually, the Arthurs had 9 children, 7 of whom were lucky enough to live to adulthood. For the next few years, the family moved frequently, as William's free will preaching and abolitionist leanings alienated the communities in which they settled. After brief stays in several small Vermont and New York towns, the family settled in Schenectady, New York in the early 1830s. William continued to travel to nearby towns and revival meetings while his growing brood remained in the Schenectady region. Arthur's peripatetic early childhood later led to accusations by political opponents that he had not been born in the United States, the rumors, of course, focusing on him being born in Canada, and thus was ineligible for the office of the Vice President of the United States. The rumors of his foreign birth also dogged him into his term as president. Though several contemporaneous reports of his foreign birth entered into the record during his political career, historians have established that he was in fact born in Vermont. Arthur was thus the first American president to face questions over whether he had been born in the United States. Take that, Obama. Historians nearly unanimously agree that he was. I mean, there's an easy way to test this. Take his blood and perform that test from the Thing. If the blood screams hoser and turns into a Mountie, then bam, you've solved it. Arthur completed his basic education at Schenectady and in Greenwich, then called Union Village, where he showed an early interest in politics as well as a pride in his Irish heritage. As a student, he joined groups which eventually organized as the Fenian Brotherhood, frequently wearing a green coat to display his allegiance. He supported the views of the Whig Party and its most powerful spokesman, Henry Clay of Kentucky. The Whigs were conservatives, opposing the westward expansion known as Manifest Destiny and a powerful presidency. They supported protective tariffs, limited immigration, and federal support of national infrastructure. Arthur's lifelong conservatism developed during his days as a student. He attended higher learning in Schenectady at Union College and worked as a schoolteacher during breaks in his curriculum. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1848. For the next few years, he worked as a schoolteacher in several New York communities while reading the law in his spare time. Eventually, he moved into school administration, serving as the principal in a co-host school before relocating to Ballston Spa, where he studied law. In 1854, Arthur was admitted to the New York bar and began practicing law in New York City at the firm of Culver, Parker, and Arthur. If you don't want to be forgotten like Chester A. Arthur, then you're going to need a snazzy website. And the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace, has you covered. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs with wares to sell, bloggers with a message to spread, and artists looking to reach the masses with their work. Whether you're just starting out or you're looking for a way to better manage your brand, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create beautiful professional websites, engage with your audience, and make sure the right people are getting your message. Squarespace's Fluid Engine makes it easier than ever for pretty much anyone to dive in and make a beautiful website. Answer a few questions about the goals you'd like to accomplish with your site, choose a template, and get dragging and dropping elements onto your template. Drag and drop technology is included in every Squarespace site. With Squarespace Blueprint and their new AI and SEO tools, you'll be able to create a fully personalized website using this guided design system. Choose from a professionally curated list of layout and design options and build a unique presence from the ground up. And with their SEO tools, you'll have all the tools you need so the algorithm will never forget you, unlike President Chester A. Arthur. And best of all, if you're selling stuff on your website, you'll be able to offer a simple yet seamless checkout experience with Squarespace's powerful tools. You'll be able to accept credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, offer customers the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now back to the most forgettable president in history. Segway. In 1855, Chester Arthur represented the plaintiff in a New York case called Jennings v. 3rd Avenue streetcar. A black woman, Elizabeth Jennings, had boarded a streetcar to take her to a church where she was an organist. The streetcar conductor had first denied her boarding, claiming the car to be full. After it was pointed out that there were, in fact, several seats open, the conductor claimed her absence was distasteful to the other passengers. What a prick. When the other passengers were nice enough to point out that such was not the case, the conductor physically evicted Jennings from the car because he was a racist jerk, apparently. At the time, most of New York's numerous streetcar companies were privately owned, and unfortunately, nearly all of them practiced some form of racial discrimination, refusing to accommodate black and in some cases Irish riders. The Jennings case drew the attention of several New York newspapers, among them the influential New York Tribune, then published by Horace Greeley. Several black churches and other organizations protested against the action, as well as the discrimination practiced by the streetcar companies. Part of the protest took the form of a lawsuit which was filed in which Arthur represented Jennings. Arthur argued the case before a jury and Judge William Rockwell. The latter, in his instructions to the jury, stated, "Colored persons, if sober, well-behaved, and free from disease, had the same rights as others and could neither be excluded by any rules of the company nor by force or violence." Elizabeth Jennings was awarded $250 in damages, roughly $8,000 in 2023 money. The 3rd Avenue Streetcar Company issued orders desegregating their streetcars and platforms. It was the beginning of desegregation for all of New York's burgeoning mass transit industry, and it thrust Chester Arthur into local prominence as an attorney and civil rights advocate, which is pretty badass. In 1856, Arthur started a new law partnership with Henry Gardner, and the two relocated to Kansas with the idea of establishing a practice in the rough and tumble frontier of the pre-Civil War days. Neither found the atmosphere in what was then called Bleeding Kansas to their liking, and they returned to New York in late 1856. Probably the name was accurate. Back in New York, Arthur married Ellen Herndon, the daughter of a recently deceased naval officer, and re-established a law practice. Eventually, Ellen and Chester had 3 children together. The firstborn, a son named William, died in 1863 at the age of 2. Another son, Chester II, and a daughter, Ellen, lived well into the ensuing 20th century. The Whig Party self-destructed in the 1840s and 1850s as internal tension over states' rights, Western expansion, mainly slaves, tariffs, and other issues of the day splintered its rank and file. From some of the shards of the old Whig Party emerged the Republican Party, and Chester Arthur found himself aligned with its views. In the late 1850s, Arthur used his growing prestige in New York legal and political circles to obtain the appointment of Judge Advocate General and the New York militia. At the time, well-organized militias formed the backbone of the American military system, since large standing armies were generally frowned upon by the federal government. Arthur's interest in a military post was as much political as it was patriotic. In early 1861, Arthur received the appointment as engineer-in-chief on the military staff of New York Governor Edwin Morgan. The appointment was an example of political patronage and was largely a sinecure until President Lincoln's request for volunteers to end the Southern insurrection later that year. Suddenly, New York needed to recruit, equip, and train military forces in larger numbers than had ever been attempted before, or even anticipated. They also needed to be housed and fed. Arthur undertook those responsibilities and more, rising in rank and in prestige during the first year of the Civil War. He did not serve at the battlefronts, but rather fought the war of the bureaucracies, dealing with contractors, vendors, and those seeking political patronage. He achieved considerable success, too. New York regiments were well equipped and trained during his time at the helm. He lost his position when a Democratic governor was elected in New York in January 1863, and he returned to his law practice. The New York draft riots and other protests and investigations into corruption in the state-run military systems took place that year, but Arthur was not in office at the time, and his reputation remained unsullied by the results. In 1864, another Republican was elected governor, but he had already promised the post previously held by Arthur to another political crony, and Arthur did not return to military duty. But he continued to gain prominence in the New York Republican Party, as well as at Tammany Hall. Arthur was a significant fundraiser for the Republican and eventually the Union Party, which returned Abraham Lincoln to the White House in the election of 1864. Former Governor Morgan continued to build and strengthen his local political machine, and forged some alliances with the Democratic Tammany Hall. Arthur was a major component of Morgan's group, and well positioned to advance politically by the end of the Civil War in 1865. Machine politics were nothing new in post-Civil War New York, with the Democrats dispensing political largesse, or gifts, and exercising political power through the machine run from Tammany Hall. The Republicans had many tentacled political machines of their own, including those of Edwin Morgan and Conkling's machine, run by boss Roscoe Conkling. When Conkling was elected to the United States Senate in 1867, he used his influence to have Arthur appointed as chairman of the Republican Executive Committee for New York City. The position provided Arthur with a platform to bestow patronage and thus build political alliances. Arthur continued to build relationships in New York City and Albany, supported by Conkling's machine. In 1869, Arthur became chief legal counsel to the New York City Tax Commission. The job was highly lucrative, paying $10,000 annually, or about $225,000 in 2023 dollars. Arthur was forced to resign in 1871 when Tammany Democrats achieved a majority in the state legislature. But President Ulysses Grant, grateful for Arthur's support in the presidential election of 1868, offered Arthur the position of Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Arthur respectfully turned the president down. He had another position in mind, one from which he could significantly build his base of political support. In December 1871, President Grant, urged by Senator Conkling and other leading Republicans, appointed Chester Arthur as collector of the Port of New York. The Port of New York, then the busiest in the United States, needed thousands of workers to assess and collect tariffs on goods shipped to the United States. The collector was responsible for all of them. Thus, Arthur had the ability to bestow jobs on thousands of workers, hiring and firing at will, and using the workers to achieve political aims through controlling how they voted. The docks and warehouses of the day were largely unregulated. Unions were scarce and mostly impotent. It was machine politics at its finest, if that is the word. The system, as it then stood, also ensured that Arthur, as well as other senior customs authorities, received a percentage of the fines levied against transgressors of the tariff system. Arthur's annual compensation exceeded $50,000 per year, more than $1 million today, and he enjoyed it by dressing and acting the part of a wealthy man, which we'll get to later. While modern eyes, looking back over 1.5 centuries, likely view the system as irretrievably corrupt, it was entirely legal at the time. And in fact, it was how the party in power stayed in power. Still, elements of reform emerged within the Republican Party, which divided into factions. The ultra-conservatives called themselves the Stalwarts and resisted reforms to the civil service and the patronage system. Arthur and Conkling aligned themselves with the Stalwarts, yet reform slowly gained ground. In 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes won the still disputed presidential election after several months of quibbling over electoral votes from Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon. Sound familiar? Under Hayes, numerous reform initiatives were passed in Congress. Arthur was removed as collector of the Port of New York in 1878. Hayes offered Arthur, whose power in Republican politics remained substantial, the position of consul general at the United States Embassy in Paris. Arthur declined. In January 1880, as Arthur mulled over his future in Albany, his wife remained in New York City. In January, she attended a benefit concert in New York representing her husband. She complained to her friends of having a cold and retired from the event early. 2 days later, on January 12th, she died of pneumonia. Arthur was devastated and would later write, upon being elected vice president, "Honors to me are not what they once were." Although Arthur was one of the most powerful politicians in the Republican Party and in New York State, he had never run for elective office on any level, as the election of 1880 loomed. At the Republican convention in Chicago in 1880, the stalwarts stood in opposition to the reform wing of the party, who called themselves the Half-Breeds. The convention struggled to find a candidate able to unite the wings of the party, eventually turning to James Garfield of Ohio to be the Republican standard-bearer. Garfield recognized the need to appease the stalwarts and unite the party, as well as to balance the ticket geographically, if there was to be any chance of defeating the Democrats and their candidate, General Winfield Scott Hancock, a hero of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Republicans turned to Arthur, a stalwart who could all but guarantee the party would carry New York and most of the northeastern states. Garfield's home state of Ohio was also considered to be an easy pickup for Republicans. Nonetheless, neither Garfield nor Arthur had run for office, and in Arthur's case, he had never even been elected by voters, building his resume solely through political appointments. Protective tariffs were a major issue of the campaign, with Republicans charging the Democrats would reduce them, allowing cheap imported goods to rob Americans of jobs. Another issue was immigration, with Republicans demanding limited immigration from Europe and none from Asia. Wow. In the end, the Republican ticket prevailed, as it had in every presidential election since 1860. Following the election, Arthur attempted to use his influence to have fellow stalwarts and political allies appointed to key positions within the incoming administration. Garfield largely ignored Arthur's suggestions and instead appointed several opponents of the stalwarts. By the time the new administration took office in March 4, 1881, Garfield and Arthur were barely speaking to each other. Their Congress was evenly divided in the Senate, which seated 37 Democrats, 37 Republicans, and 1 independent. Although Arthur could cast the deciding vote in the event of ties, the Senate struggled to confirm many of Garfield's appointments. The House could do little more than await events in the Senate. The government was effectively deadlocked throughout the first session of Congress. The Senate went into recess in May 1881, and Arthur went home to New York and from there to Albany, where he learned on July 2nd that Garfield had been shot. The president had been awaiting a train at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station in Washington when approached by an assassin who fired 2 shots with a revolver. Garfield was hit in the back and in the arm. His assassin, as he was seized by onlookers, shouted, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president." Upon being shot by a disgruntled political office seeker named Charles Guiteau, President Garfield was returned to the White House, conscious and able to consult with his physicians over his chances. At first, he seemed to be recovering, but doctors were unable to remove the bullet. Several innovative attempts to locate the bullet, including a primitive metal detector built by Alexander Graham Bell, failed. In Bell's case, because the president was reclined on a bed of metal springs, which confused the detector. In September, his doctors removed the president to Elberon, New Jersey, in the vain hopes that sea air could aid in the stricken man's recovery. James Garfield died of sepsis on September 19, 1881, in New Jersey, more than 2 months after having been wounded by the assassin's bullets. During that time, the United States had been without a chief executive. There was no 25th Amendment at the time, which dictated the role of various government officers should the president be incapacitated, as Garfield certainly was. nor had Chester Arthur moved to ascend to the presidency. Arthur viewed such an action while the president was still alive to be unseemly. Throughout that long summer, as Garfield struggled for life, Chester Arthur remained in New York, staying at his Lexington Avenue home. He learned of Garfield's death on September 19th and took the oath of office at home in the early morning hours of September 20th. He traveled by train to Long Beach, New Jersey for Garfield's funeral, returned to New York, and then journeyed to Washington, arriving on September 21st. And he refused to go to the White House, taking up residence at the home of a friend, Senator John Jones. At first, this was to allow Mrs. Garfield sufficient time to mourn before moving out of the residence, and later to allow significant renovations to the executive mansion to be completed. A strange thing happened to the old stalwart and longtime beneficiary of the patronage system within the civil service. Arthur became a staunch supporter of civil service reform, beginning with the post office and extending to the customs service. On January 16, 1883, Arthur signed into law the Civil Service Reform Act, which he had championed from the stump and in party caucuses. It established civil service selection and promotions based on an examination. Arthur used the power of his office to speed implementation of the reform, and in 1884 was able to exclaim the new system provided competent and faithful public servants, as well as precluded personal favoritism in the appointment of federal jobs and positions. Arthur also faced a problem which few modern presidents confront. A significant budget surplus swelled the federal coffers. To reduce it, he proposed reductions in the protective tariffs on imports. Congressional wrangling reduced the amounts of the reductions well below those he supported, but facing a hostile protectionist faction in Congress, he signed it into law. He also supported increased federal spending on infrastructure. The bill Congress presented him focused too much on money in certain areas represented by powerful congressmen and senators in Arthur's estimation, rather than spreading the spending evenly. Arthur vetoed the bill, but Congress overrode him, and infrastructure spending increased under his administration. Arthur also led the effort to rebuild and modernize the United States Navy, creating a modern fleet of armored, steam-powered vessels, as well as overseas bases that would provide them with coal and other supplies. The contentious issue of immigration occupied much of the time in Arthur's administration in Congress. Arthur signed bills that included the Immigration Act of 1882, which imposed a tax on new immigrants of 50 cents, and excluded from entry those convicted of crimes, the mentally ill, or anyone unable to demonstrate that they were capable of sustaining their own support. He also signed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which denied entry to Chinese workers for a period of 10 years. Though Arthur personally opposed the act as discriminatory, in a possible nod to his civil rights work as a lawyer decades earlier, he signed it as an act of political expediency. So much for give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, huh? He also signed into law the Edmunds Act, which made polygamy a federal crime, a step he took to curb the growing power of the Church of Latter-day Saints in the Utah Territory. Sorry, Mormons. Sometime prior to his nomination for the office of vice president, Arthur was diagnosed with a kidney ailment known as Bright's disease. Today, it is known as nephritis. Throughout his term as president, Arthur's health weakened. He lost weight and was frequently described as pale and exhausted. He made several trips outside of Washington in an attempt to bolster his failing health, but his condition worsened throughout his term in office. By 1884, Arthur had little appetite for the strains of a political campaign for re-election. In response to party leaders and supporters from the business world, he made a half-hearted attempt to secure the nomination of the Republican Party. But his old opponents, the half-breeds, united behind James G. Blaine of Maine. Arthur did little to oppose him and lost the nomination after 4 ballots in that year's convention. He refused to participate in the general campaign, and Blaine lost the election, and the Republicans the White House, to Democrat Grover Cleveland. Arthur returned to New York and his law firm in 1885. He resisted attempts by local Republicans to have him run for Senate, and in 1886 traveled to New London, Connecticut to rest and recover. He returned to New York late that summer. In November, his health began to fail rapidly, and he occupied his time by burning all of his private papers and correspondence. The old-timey version of deleting your internet history, although it is interesting to note that President Arthur once said, "I may be president of the United States, but my private life is nobody's damn business." So this is pretty on-brand behavior, And now that I really think about it, Chester Arthur was basically like if Ron Swanson and Tim Gunn from Project Runway had a time-traveling baby. On November 18th, 1886, Chester Arthur died after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage the preceding day, and he was buried next to his wife in Menands, New York. Chester Arthur's home at 123 Lexington Avenue, New York, was where he was when he took the oath of office as president, where he signed the Civil Service Act, and where both he and his wife died. In fact, it still stands today as the home of the Kalustyan's Spice Emporium in the city's Rose Hill neighborhood. Well, I certainly hope you found this video to be entertaining and informative, and if you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and keep it tuned here to Biographics for more like this. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.